Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin Atidani. Thank you very much for dedicating this hour to spend with us on our webinar. Okay, as you can see, I'm not alone. I'm with three lovely ladies, Leanne, Natasha, as well as Janice. I'll introduce them in more detail as we go ahead with our discussion. Okay, now, why are we here? I'm sure most of us are aware that a whole lot of South Africans have been battling when it comes to financial matters. A whole lot of our workforce has been battling out there. And stats would actually tell you that about 3 or 4% of South Africans, sorry, it's muted. Sorry, guys. I think so. Stats will tell you that a whole lot of, stats will tell you that a whole lot of South Africans are really battling when it comes to retirement, and most of us do not retire with enough money. And this is basically because most of us do not preserve our retirement benefits when we change jobs, and also because we find ourselves in situations where whenever we leave our employment, we take our benefits in cash. We're kind of like stealing from the old man, all the old people that we're going to be. Now, because of such happening, the National Treasury in December released a discussion paper that basically talks about a two-bucket system, which is going to be what we're going to be talking about today. And while we're still on this, another scary statistic that we just received from SARS is that 78 billion has been lost or has been accessed through the retirement fund system. So that is very, very scary. So what the government has been trying to do is to try and ensure that there is some form of control when it comes to people preserving their retirement benefits. Yes, there has been that particular need where people have to access some money, and basically it falls on one notion that the retirement fund is most probably our biggest retirement fund savings. And when people actually battle financially, that's one of the only avenues where we feel that we can actually take money. So the government has looked at this, and they've come up with a bucket system, a two-pot bucket system, where they're saying that, guys, you can manage to have a certain amount where you can actually access from your retirement fund, and a certain amount where you can, when you're forced to preserve and only access this money when you go on retirement. Now, the government employees pension fund has been part of this, as well as preservation funds and retirement communities, and these are also being considered to fall under the new bucket system. Like I mentioned, I'm with three lovely ladies here, Leanne van Beek, Natasha Hanchi, as well as Janice Massenkamp. It's a whole lot of wealth of experience that I'm sitting with right now. I've actually done a quick calculation prior to this presentation. It comes out to about 70 years of experience.
We're not that old.
Not 70, 78 years of experience on one particular individual, but combined.
I'm glad you said that.
Okay, our first speaker is basically going to be Leanne van Beek. And Leanne is the director of ICTS, and she provides independent legal services to retirement funds and service providers. She has been involved in providing legal services in financial service industry for more than 25 years. Okay, Leanne is active in several industry organizations, including being the past president and an honorary member of the Pension Lawyers Association, the editor of an international legal journal, and belongs to various committees of the Institute of Retirement Funds. And then we got Natasha on my far right. Natasha is an approved valuator to both defined benefit as well as defined contribution funds. And she's also an approved liquidator. She provides actuarial consulting, valuations and investment consulting to employee benefit industry, and has more than 28 years experience in the EB industry. Natasha has a Bachelor of Business Science degree and is a fellow of the Institute of Actuaries in the UK and Actuarial Society of South Africa. She has a postgraduate diploma in financial planning, and she's also a certified financial planner. Last but not least, Janice, who I think has got one of the most difficult jobs in this industry, because these are the people that get out there and get to speak to members and relay all this information. And considering that this is a very dynamic, always changing industry, they always find themselves having to be on the ball with all the changes. Janice has 13 years experience in consulting and retirement funds, and she's also responsible for the retirement fund consulting team within NMG. I must say I've had a pleasure of working with her for the past 4 years. She has a BCom degree in marketing from the University of Johannesburg, a postgraduate diploma in financial planning from the University of Free State, and has completed a management development program through GIBS. Janice is also a certified financial planner. Okay, so we're going to have our first speaker, Leanne van Wyk, and she's going to talk about what has been proposed, where the gaps are, and what still needs to be confirmed. Okay, over to you, Leanne.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you so much for having me today. Thank you to NMG, and it's good to be here. So I'm just going to take you through the basic proposals in relation to the two-pot system. And what we're going to do is we're going to start at a high level, and then we're going to work our way down into some of the detail. Please think about your questions. In the meantime, you're welcome to send those through. Okay, so if we look at the two discussion papers that were issued, they were issued in December last year, which is something that happens often to us in the industry. We often get new stuff in December. And it was two separate discussion papers. Today, we're focusing on the first one. So the first one is around the two-pot system. It also dealt with auto-enrollment. We're not dealing with auto-enrollment today. The second discussion paper was around the governance of umbrella funds, but don't be fooled by the title because it actually deals with a lot more than that. But today, we're going to focus on this two-pot system. Okay, so before we get there, let's just have a little discussion around what Treasury is trying to solve for in relation to both these discussion papers, but especially this two-pot system. So the first thing is there are two design problems that Treasury has identified in relation to retirement funds. So the first one is that and Martin was talking about this earlier, is that members don't preserve their benefits in their retirement fund until retirement, right? We know that. I've got a couple of stats on the next page, which we'll talk about, but basically a lot of members, they leave employment and they take their money. Okay. Then the other design problem that they've identified is that if you're a member of the fund, you actually have to leave employment before you can access any of your money sitting in the fund. Okay. So if you get those two problems together, it results in a perfect storm. So if we look at what Treasury is aiming for in relation to this two-pot system, they have two conflicting aims or imperatives. The first one is they want to encourage South Africans to save more for retirement, right? They want to get South Africans to retirement in a better state. The second thing is that they want to allow South Africans some access to their benefits while they are still employed because they are in financial distress. So of course you can see that those two imperatives, saving more for retirement, giving a little bit of access now, they conflict. Okay, I think it's a good initiative that Treasury has decided not just to allow access, but to look at some sort of preservation as well. And I think that is necessary in the system. Okay, so said we'd look at a few stats. So these are stats that came from SARS and Treasury. I thought they were quite interesting. So what we're seeing is that in the last 3 years, 700,000 people cashed out. So took a withdrawal benefit and cashed out their benefits when they terminated employment. All right, and what we see there is around half of that number received a lump sum through retirement or retrenchment. Okay, so half of that number retired. They also said that the tax, just the tax paid on a withdrawal lump sum is over 12 billion rand each year. Okay. And that relates to that stat at the bottom, which says that 78 billion rand is taken out of the retirement system through withdrawals every year. Okay, so that is what they're trying to address. That huge, massive amount of money leaving the system, even though it's taxed on a punitive rate. Okay, so let's get down to some of the characteristics of our two pots. Okay, so on our left on your slide, we've got pot one. Now, what pot one is that is our preservation or retirement pot. All this jargon and naming is still settling down, so people are calling it different things, but today we'll call it the preservation or retirement pot. Then we've got pot two, which is on the right of your slide, and that is the access pot. We're going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of these pots, and as I said, we're going to start at a high level, and then we're going to get into more detail as we go through today. Okay, we all want to be on the same page. So if we look at pot one as the start, which is our preservation or retirement pot. So the first thing we must note is that this pot has to be preserved until retirement. Right? You do not get access to this pot before retirement. We'll talk about some of the exceptions to that as we go down, but that is the general rule. Then you have to retire to get access to this pot, right? No access on withdrawal. You only get access to this pot one on retirement. And then the idea is that 2/3 of your net contributions that are going into the retirement fund for you will go into this pot one. And I say net contributions because it'll be your contributions, 2/3 of your contributions, less things like administration fees or risk premiums and that type of thing. Okay. Then you get investment growth on the contributions in that pot. So that pot continues to grow with contributions and investment growth. We look at pot two on the other hand, so now we're looking at the access pot. So this is the pot that's going to allow members going forward to access their money from time to time. So the idea is that it can be accessed at any time for any reason. And so you can see we've already moved from this concept of accessing this money for financial distress. So that we hope that members do access it for financial distress, but it is likely that they won't have to provide much proof around that, and this will simply be, they'll just be allowed to access it. We'll talk about how financial distress comes into it in a couple of slides' time. So accessing this at any time for any reason. Then members don't need to resign from their employment to get access to this pot. And that is very important. So you can be in employment in your retirement fund and get access to this pot. Then in the proposals, Treasury is talking about, should there be a minimum amount in your access pot before you're allowed to take it out? And so that we know, for example, that every time you access your pot, that costs the fund money, right? Because your administrator is charging you for to pay that money out, etc. So what they're thinking about is having a minimum amount in your access pot before you're allowed to access it. And they talked about 2,000 Rand. Of course, just to note that these proposals are the first draft of proposals. And Janice will talk later about the process that we have to go through to get to finalization and implementation. But I'm very sure that some of this will still change. Okay. So we've got that minimum amount. Then 1/3 of contributions will go into this pot. And again, it's net contributions going into this pot. And on both pots, these contributions will go into these pots from a date yet to be decided. So it could be, 1 March 2023, 1 March 2024, whatever they decide. But for this webinar purposes, we are calling that date 2020X, right? Because we don't know when it will be. So from date 2020X, your contributions are going to be split into these two parts. Then continuing on the access part. So one of the proposals was that withdrawing members must pay for the cost of that access to the access pot. Okay. Now, when we have participated in industry bodies in relation to these proposals, what we can see is there's been quite a differing opinion in relation to this particular proposal. So some people are saying, yes, we think that withdrawing members should pay the costs of a withdrawal. And other people are saying, well, no, we think this should be left up to a fund, right? Because, for example, a fund might have an expense pot that they can use up or whatever the case may be. So there's a split opinion. Most people are saying, yes, withdrawing members should pay. Others are saying, leave it up to the fund. The next issue I want to talk to in relation to this access pot is that when a member comes to access their benefit for the amount of their benefit from the access pot, they're going to have to do a few things. So one is update their contact details, okay, because we're always on this drive to ensure that we have members up-to-date contact details. So every time we get a chance to touch the member, we would want to update their contact details. So I don't think that's a bad thing. However, the proposal is also that they will be required to go through some sort of retirement benefit counselling, like RBC, or some sort of financial awareness. So it might not be the full RBC, but some sort of financial awareness. I know Natasha is going to have something to say about that as well when she talks. But the point is that if we are doing this sort of RBC when members are accessing their pot, it's likely that we're going to be doing a lot more of it, right? Because we're going to have a lot more access to access pots as opposed to the old school with terminating employment and now withdrawing from the fund. So we're likely to have a lot more of that if it is a final requirement. Then the other proposal is if a member decides, right, I'm going to access my access pot, then they should be given the option to say, I want to increase my contributions in order to make up what I've taken out of it. Of course, that gives rise to a lot of discussion around different funds actually being able to implement that type of proposal. You know, is it an increase in contributions? Is it an additional voluntary contribution? What will the rules say, etc.? So that has really not been fleshed out. It was just we think this might be a good idea. And then, of course, just like your preservation or retirement pot, on your access pot, once your contributions have gone in there, you will have investment growth on that. Okay, so that's the basics of the two pots, and as we go, we're going to expand on some of this. Right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is the protection of vested amounts. Now, this is where we've got the potential to get very confused because of all the jargon that's used in our industry. But when I'm talking now about vested amounts, and when Treasury talks in this discussion paper around vested amounts, what they are talking about here is anything that a member has built up in their retirement fund before date 2020X. So we're not talking about annuitization vested. Okay. Anything that the member has built up in their retirement fund before date 2020X. Okay, so that is what they talk about, vested amount. Now, Treasury said they want to protect vested amounts. Now, what they mean by protect is to say, you know, if you're sitting in a retirement fund now and these new proposals come in, then we don't want you to be, you know, terribly worse off once those proposals come in. So, for example, we may decide that at date 2020X, we sort of ring fence what's already in your retirement fund and we treat that amount differently, that vested amount. Okay, so what we're talking about in relation to vested amounts is once this two-pot system is implemented on date 2020X, and remember there may be phased and effective dates for this, it might not all come in at the same time, is there will be some allowance after date 2020X for members if they leave the fund, so they terminate their employment and they leave the fund, there will be some access to your vested amount. Okay. So if you're sitting in a fund after 2028, you've built up this big amount, you terminate, the usual rule would be you only get access to your access fund. But if you've got a vested amount, something built up already, you will be allowed access to that, or some of it at least. Okay. So there's been no talk about how much you will have access to, but it's likely it will be most of it if the proposals go forward like this. So if you join a fund after date 2020X, right? You haven't got anything vested. You join it after 2020X. You won't have any vested amounts, right? You'll only have your access pot and your retirement pot. What that means is if you then withdraw, only get access to your access pot. That's it. Okay. Right. If you transfer from one fund to another, the idea is that you transfer your vested pots with you, so you don't lose that vesting as you transfer. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about preservation funds later. All right, so your vested amounts are then going to be an additional pot, okay? Plus the wrinkle is that you also have your annuitization pots, right, that we talked about last year in our publications to clients. Right, so let's talk a little bit about immediate partial access. Okay, so this is the part that I think will excite many members and that some of the labor movement would be pushing for. So what we're looking at here is, we understand we'll have the two parts and the vested part, but what about when this legislation comes in, what are we going to get access to immediately? What will we be allowed access to upfront? Okay, and this has been hotly debated. And I know, Natasha, you'll talk a little bit about it as well. But it's been debated, everything from, for example, a CISA saying no, there should be no immediate partial access. You should only build up your access pot from date 2020X and have access to that, to others saying, well, no, we want access to, quite a bit of our vested benefit upfront because of the fact that our members are in financial distress, and everything in between. So if we look at what's actually proposed, what they were saying is that they think that there should be once-off partial access to some of what you already have in your funds, so some of your vested amounts. And the talk has been a percentage, for example, 10% of your retirement benefits up to a maximum of 25,000 Rand. So that's the sort of percentages and numbers that have been bandied around. So if your 10% is less than 25,000, you get your 10%. If your 10% is more than 25,000, you'd only get your 25,000. So there's this cap. Then some of what has been discussed is, well, why should you have access to this? And this is where the financial distress comes into play. So this is where Treasury is saying that understand that this immediate partial access should be around people who require it because they are in financial distress, and there should be some sort of evidence of that. And the sort of evidence that Treasury has talked about in the proposals is, well, it should be in relation to SARS as an example, where SARS would look at your PAYE or your provisional tax payments and say, right, there's been this drop in income. You can see that. Okay. So that would give rise to them saying, yes, well, then you're allowed partial access. But of course, this is something that would worry me if I was a trustee, because I wouldn't, as a trustee, want to have the right to say, well, you member one, yes, you can have access, but you member two, no, you can't, right? And be responsible for getting all the evidence around that. Member two comes to you and says, well, I didn't have a drop in income, but my wife did. Now I must look at the financials for the household, et cetera, et cetera. So I can tell you that the comments on this has been very varied. Some people say, or some organizations will say, well, yes, we want control over this. We want to be able to set the policies and the rules around access. And others are saying, we do not want to touch us with a barge pole. We don't want people toying outside our building, and we don't want one member being treated differently to another member, as an example. So we would want strict rules around this. So there's a lot of diversity in the comments around that. And then, of course, there's the issue that this is, of course, quite difficult to administer. And one of the issues that has been raised is if we get this immediate run on partial access. It's likely that administrators, as an example, are going to be working outside of turnaround times, that they've agreed with clients, et cetera, if there's this great initial run. And of course, that great initial run, that would be limited in a rand amount or percentage amount, but also there's this question around, would it be once off, or are we just going to take this amount and put it into our access pot, as an example, and then allow access as and when members would like it? So there's that sort of discussion taking place as well. So we're left with what is a multiple pot system. I know Natasha's going to talk a little bit about this as well. So we've got our access pots, right? The first little circle there. We've got our access pots with 1/3 of contributions going in from day 2020X. We've got our preservation or retirement pot with 2/3 of our contributions going in there from 2020X. Then we've got in that square there, right? We've got our vested amount, our 2-pot vested amount. And of that amount, some of it will be in different pots in relation to an annuitization. Okay, so we do have a slightly more complex system than just a 2-pot system. Right? Introducing the 2 pots actually introduces more administrative segmentation than just 2 pots. And then, of course, the arrow is just showing that from your vested amount, you may be seeding an amount into your access pot. Seeding just means we are taking some of what we've already built up and putting it into our access pot. That's what seeding means. And so if you hear about the seeding debate, that is what they're talking about. Okay, so if we look at a pre-retirement withdrawal as an example, if you've got a pre-retirement withdrawal, so you're actually leaving employment and you're leaving your fund, what would you get? So you would get everything that is in your access pot, right? Then you would get nothing that is in your preservation or retirement pot. That will have to stay in the fund until you retire. And then in relation to your vested amount, okay, it's likely that you will get some of what is in your vested amount. Okay. Right, so I'm going to leave it there for now. And I'm going to hand over to Natasha, who's going to build on some of what we've said, and then we'll come back for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. All right, great. Yeah, so I'm kind of coming at it a little bit from the my membership of the Actuarial Society of South Africa, where I've been a member since 2002 and previous past vice chair and chair. And through that capacity, I was actually contacted in May last year already to be part of a task force to advise National Treasury on this. They asked for some modelling, some input. At that stage, they were also really looking around loans. Do we use loans as a way of doing this rather than doing the access? And so we did some modelling for them. And the task force kind of came up and kind of said, look, we think the loans is not a good way, but the modelling shows us that the access pot actually does improve outcomes. And I mean, it was quickly, I mean, it's literally within 10 days we were asked and we had to present numbers. So it was really, really rapid. And then obviously what we presented, I think, fed through into this December paper. So what I'm going to do is just show some of the results of the modelling and then highlight some of the key submissions that the Actuarial Society has then subsequently given, and if there's time, go through some of the complications. All right, so if we look at the modelling, so those of you who've been consulted with would have known that the Uber thing that consultants and actuaries always want is this full preservation. We want your blue line, we want you to save your money forever and a day, and you're going to start at day 1 at 20, and you're going to retire at 65, and you're going to have accumulated this fantastic pot. The reality is the green line, people are building up and cashing in that money, and I think this assumes every 6 or 7 years, and you can see that maybe they eventually at 50 think, okay, well, I'll stop doing this and I won't resign, but they're building up. You can see that green line a much lower benefit, and so we kind of said, well, look, what happens if we have this 2-pot system available, and what does this look like? And again, over a 45-year working lifetime, and that's the red line in the middle. And you can see it builds up, and you're kind of cashing in a little bit every now and then, but because you're not be able to withdraw the whole thing, you end up with a much higher projected benefit at retirement. And what's important actually is if you look not only at the total benefit, which is the red line, but what is the portion that you can get as a pension? And that's much more important. So the light turquoise line there is then kind of what the reality is, that members are they've built up their pot. A third of that again is available to them at retirement. So they're retiring with very low annuity values. Whereas if you look at the two-pot system, you can see that purple line, your retirement pot or your preservation pot, is very much, that's the bulk of your benefit. Depending on when last you accessed your withdrawal. So members are really then looking at a really good retirement outcome. And if you can look at the scale, I mean, you're looking at 3 times potentially pension benefits that members could have if we go to this retirement pot system with this forced preservation against the current reality that many South Africans face. So obviously, yes, ideally we'd like everyone to be on the top line. Reality is that everyone's on the bottom line, and this is going to take them through. So I think that our modelling really showed, I think the right outcome of balancing these two needs, I think as well, that Leanne spoke about. And so our submission, just to kind of focus on some of the little details that we talk about, is that there's been a lot of research what people are doing with their cash at retirement as well. And anecdotally, they're paying off bonds, they're paying off loans, they're paying off school, putting their children through university, etc. So our kind of feeling is that it's actually a cash pot. It's not a part of your benefits, a cash pot, and therefore, get it when you need it. If my child goes to varsity when I'm 50, why should I have to borrow and then only get the pot, that third when I'm 60? So we feel that the complexity around a needs-based audit and all of those things needs to potentially fall away. And then similarly, and this is probably a more controversial one, is that on the seeding, why limited to 25,000? If I've got a 30,000 Rand problem, why must I be limited to 25,000? And rather, we do want to avoid the kind of run on the bank. We don't want people to take out their full benefit. So rather allow people to seed what they're going to put, what they need, and rather pay it out slowly. So we potentially say, well, look, you might have a 75,000. So we're only going to pay you 25,000 a year. So we're not going to solve all your problems immediately. So that saves the run on the bank. But at least it means that you can, if your problem's bigger, that, there is some ability to access those funds. And then, and actually, if we use a self-limiting mechanism, so in other words, whatever you decide to see, so in other words, Leanne spoke about, you can have these vested pots which you might always be able to access. But if you want something in your access pot, let's put an equivalent amount into your retirement pot or your vested pot. And that's going to be self-limiting, because I'm going to think twice about putting my whole benefit in, because then I'm going to tie it up. So people, I think, will look at their needs and be able to structure their own finances accordingly. So that was kind of our submission around that. And as I said, perhaps rather than just do a phased payout of that access pot over a 3-year, maybe even a 5-year period, to prevent the kind of run on the bank. And then our other thing, which is that we think perhaps might be a solution, is Leanne spoke about, we've got those 4 pots, and one of those pots is actually now a non-vested pot, which is now vested. And so it's very confusing. And potentially that money that's sitting in this annuitization vested pot is going to be 2 or 3 years worth of contributions. It's not going to be a lot. And our suggestion is that we actually default all of those members, all of that money in that annuitization into the 2-pot system automatically, so that we don't, we kind of do away. And I borrowed Leanne's slide here. And just to say that our thinking is that if we take away that annuitization non-vested pot, which, as I say, for some people, it might be their own money, only money, and then it just simplifies the administration in the long run. So that's one of our key submissions that we put through. So we'll see if Treasury takes that on board. And then just a couple of other complications and discussion points, just to kind of highlight a couple of things. Admin systems is a problem, obviously, but we already are sitting in a situation where we've had to cater for vested within provident funds, you're paying pensions, you're not paying pensions, there are different, and I think the building blocks of the admin systems are kind of in place for pension and provident funds. I think RA and PRES funds possibly haven't got there, so they need to think about that. Obviously, there's upfront, if there is seed funding, there's going to be lots of costs in communication and how it happens, and that's going to add to complexity. But we can simplify the admin systems by simplifying the seed capital, simplifying the cost of counselling and all of those things at retirement, the needs audits, the upfront tax, all of those things, we can simplify the administration. And then obviously Leanne also spoke about this, to the extent that there are any costs, they would need to be proportionate against all the pots. And then our other thinking is also just around the way that the paper is worded, is that it's 2/3, 1/3. And we're saying we should allow people to structure their benefits differently. So someone might want to not have a full third going into the access pot. So we should be allowed to put more than 2/3 into their retirement/preservation pot and less than 1/3 into the access pot. So we feel that the act should be worded carefully around that to permit that flexibility. So the default would be 1/3, 2/3, but I might decide on a 90-10 split for my own personal circumstances, and that might maximize tax efficiency, and then obviously to the extent that you do have money in your access pot at retirement that you're not going to cash and you want to use it to buy a pension, obviously we need to look at the technicalities around voluntary annuities. DB funds are complicated. We can spend a whole day on discussing DB funds. So I think the only thing really around our submission here is just to say that we think that the benefits would be paid out on service rather than on contribution. So in other words, I'll cash in, I've got 10 years of service, I'll cash in 3 years rather than contribution, so that it just makes it easier. And then I think I've spoken about the seed capital, that I think we think that you kind of, if you limit it and you match it with a preservation thing, that will solve a lot of issues. So I think that's it from me, and I think we then are into our panel discussion.
I must say thank you very much, Letitia. And I suppose we're very, very privileged to actually have someone that actually sits in the forefront, someone that actually has a say on how these things actually get to be, before these things get to be implemented. Janice, just getting into the panel discussion, since you're one of the guys that are key in the consulting division and stuff like that, what is the timing of these changes? When do you think these changes will be implemented?
So after having today's discussion, I think we're a long way away from it. We obviously know that comment is back with Treasury, and they'll work through those comments and draft legislation around that. So we'll have draft legislation, which will then come back to industry for additional comments before it's published and formalised. But I also think from the discussion is that it's not just simply legislation being published that can have been effective. Administrators are going to have to do a lot of system changes, and they can't do those now. It's too costly. We're not really sure what the final outcome is going to be. So admin systems are only going to be updated once the legislation has been published. And then from there, I do think from the discussions that we've had this morning is that there should be a phased-in approach when legislation comes in. And that gives administrators the time to make the system changes and for us to communicate with stakeholders. As Natasha mentioned and Leanne, is that there's a lot of communication that needs to happen. It's not only just to members, but to boards and the like. So I do think it's a long way away, maybe something coming in 2024.
You touched on communication. So do you think this is the right time for us to actually start communicating with members and trustees, or this needs to happen at the implementation stage?
So I think it's a phased approach again from a communication perspective. So we've already communicated in the form of our first dashboard of this year of 1 of 2022, which high level gave the basis around the discussion papers. Communicating going forward, I think again it will be phased. So as we have more insight into what National Treasury is thinking and what the legislation is going to look like into the future, we'll then need to communicate with the relevant stakeholders through that process. So and there's a lot of elements of communication. So there'd be the initial communication to members, advising them of the potential changes and the effective date of that. And then, as Leanne alluded to, a lot of retirement benefit counselling is going to come into this process as well. So if members are going to have that immediate access to that access pot, we want to counsel members around that, educate members so that they understand the implications. And then obviously, again, at withdrawal and retirement through their career, you're going to want to communicate to members. So I think from a consulting perspective, we really want to engage more with employers and trustee boards and really formulate a communication strategy that's going to work best for their funds, their membership profile, and making sure that we're communicating appropriately. So it's not just necessary just do a once-off communication to say that you have this legislation coming. It will be ongoing throughout the working life of that individual.
Thanks. And Natasha, how will fund liquidity requirements be affected by this two-part system?
So interestingly, we don't think actually that much. Other than obviously to the extent that there's a seed capital and there's the initial run on the back. And the reason for this is twofold. The one being that the money, so first of all, the vested benefits are going to remain invested as they are in Regulation 28 portfolios. Secondly, funds are already paid out. I mean, and Leanne showed the stats, 78 billion paid out, 78 billion paid out versus 248 billion going in contributions. So that's a third of contributions are already being paid out every year. So funds are used to paying that. So the fact that we're now going to be paying out a third of contributions is actually, it's exactly the same. And actually, funny enough, what will happen potentially, so your vested pot will be vested the same. Your access pot may be a little bit more liquidity on the requirements, but then your retirement pot or your preservation pot is actually going to be able to invest it much more long term. We're going to be able to take advantage of the infrastructure type products and the alternative investments, which have a much longer time horizon. So actually, overall, if you're looking at the fund, potentially even a little bit less liquid with a longer term horizon. So as I said, other than the initial run where everyone cashes in what they've accrued, we think it's going to be.
Back to you, Janice. When it comes to fund rules, suppose are there going to be any changes when it comes to fund rules?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really going to be dependent on each fund and how those rules are structured. Those fund rules that are far more descriptive will require a lot more amendments. And then also you've got the element of SARS. We don't know what SARS requirements are going to be. So we've seen when annuitisation came into effect in 2019, SARS was quite descriptive of how they wanted rules to be structured and the wording that they required. So if SARS says to us, you're going to have a lot more descriptive wording around the two-pot system, you would then have to obviously again make sure that all the amendments are compliant with those requirements set out by SARS.
Back to you, Leanne. Right. So how will preservation funds, retirement annuities, and plain benefit funds, as well as beneficiary funds, be affected by this two-part system?
Thanks, Martin. So perhaps let me deal with those separately.
Okay.
So I think that if you look at an unclaimed benefit fund first, so that type of fund doesn't have ongoing contributions right into it. So and same thing with beneficiary funds. They get an amount in and you don't get an ongoing contribution. So those two types of funds are not going to be affected by this two-pot system. So we don't need to worry about those too much. If we look at retirement annuity funds, now here, we're going to see potentially big changes. Okay? Because if you look at a retirement annuity fund, at the moment, your benefit is really stuck there until age 55, right? There's a few minor exceptions to that, but basically you're stuck there till the age 55. But what Treasury said is they recognize that a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners actually save through retirement annuity funds. And it wouldn't be fair to give, pension and provident fund members access, but not retirement annuity funds members access. In fact, they felt that they could be more vulnerable than those in, for example, formal employment. So they are definitely looking at an access pot for retirement annuity funds. So the same two-pot system, which will mean that if that goes forward, you will actually get more access to your retirement annuity fund than you do now. And Treasury have said that that is like completely deliberate on their part. They understand that that will be the effect. But of course, what does that mean then? That means that your retirement annuity funds are actually almost identical to every other pension and provident fund out there, right? So the only difference then between your retirement annuity funds and your pension and your occupational funds, as an example, is that your occupational funds are linked to an employer and your retirement annuity funds aren't. So does that mean that, that will change the landscape of how we look at retirement funds going forward? It might. So that's retirement annuity fund big changes. And also, of course, we've got those really old retirement annuity funds, that are smoothing, all sorts of other complications. And of course, those it may take longer to get those into the two-pot system. So they might allow for what Janice was talking about earlier, which is that phased-in approach on retirement annuity funds. And then lastly, on PRES funds, so preservation, pension and provident funds, the main message that we should be giving, and that trustees should be giving as well, is that if the proposals go forward like they are now, then members are not going to be worse off if they are in a preservation fund under the new two-pot system than they are now. So preservation fund members shouldn't be panicking about, let me get my money out of here, or, should I actually, if I'm leaving now, should I actually go to a PRES fund because I'm worried about this? Okay, they're not going to be worse off. And the idea is that if you are transferring from like an occupational fund to a preservation fund, that your pot system in the transferal fund will be mirrored in the preservation fund. So you'll take your access pot with you and you'll be allowed access to that. You'll take your retirement pot with you and you won't be allowed access to that except for your once-off withdrawal. And then your vested pot, same thing. Okay, so we're going to have this mirroring. If you go through those preservation fund and you try and work it all out and understand what's going to happen, that seems to be what they're saying. Let's just mirror the system in your occupational fund. But you might even be better off, because if you're in a preservation fund now and you've already taken your once-off withdrawal, so say you had 100,000 and you've taken 50,000, you still got 50,000 there. When this two-pot system comes in, you will be given an access pot. So they'll be seeding into that access pot from what's already in your PRES fund, and then you'll be allowed more access. So you've taken your one withdrawal, but now you'll have access to access pot. So in that point of view, you're actually better off under a preservation fund in this new system. But having said that, we do need to just be very clear that these are all still proposals, right? And what we may see is something different, but the intention, Treasury's intention, is very important. And they are saying they want to protect preservation fund members. And they also recognize that if you're in a preservation fund and you've already taken your once-off withdrawal, you're in a very vulnerable position. Okay, so they want to allow more access, just like if you're in any other fund.
Okay. The more you talk, the more I realize the need for us to have benefit counselors as well as financial advisors, because there's serious financial decisions that people actually need to make.
Yeah.
All right, Natasha, will there be any tax changes as a result of the two-pot system?
We're not sure, is the short answer. Treasury in their paper asked questions around 4 different ways of structuring the tax. And the modelling and things we did around it is that a lot of the options they're looking at aren't really going to work. There is some appetite in some quarters for changing the contributions into the access pot to be not tax deductible and the benefit paid out tax free, but that has a lot of implications on take home pay and that sort of thing. And so the bulk of the submissions that I've seen and the general feeling is that we need to leave the tax system unchanged. But the key thing that we need to do is de-link all the elements, because at the moment, your withdrawal benefit, if you access it, it's penal towards your retirement benefit and your retrenchment as well. So I think that the general consensus is that leave it as it is, but just de-link it so that if you do take your access pots withdrawals and are taxed over your working lifetime, then you're not going to then be penalized again at retirement. So I think that's the general consensus. Whether or not Treasury lands there or not, is we remain to be seen.
Okay. All right, Janice, back to you. All right, we all are aware that in the past we could manage to access these funds through housing loans and stuff like that. So what about deductions like housing loans? Will legislative changes be required?
So housing loans is quite complex. So you've got existing housing loans that you'd have to look at and then future housing loans. So existing housing loans, once the two-pot system comes in, it's great. You're going to have to be careful from an administrative perspective on what money goes into the access pot, because you've obviously got a home loan and your existing fund credit is, your home loaner has that surety for that existing fund credit. And when you move money into that access pot, you could potentially dilute that surety. So when it becomes legislation, you'd have to carefully look at each member of record individually and make sure that the surety stays within the non-access pot, and then that can move into the access pot. For future home loans, again, it's going to have to be how you're going to structure that home loan and where the money is going to sit. So we'll have to be careful on making sure that the money that isn't accessible to a member during his working life is ring-fenced to what the home loan amount is that you're going to be able to access into the future.
Okay. Maintenance orders?
And maintenance orders I think is the easier one. So the way maintenance orders are structured at the moment is that your order is inclusive of all the benefits. We do see that the order of the maintenance order be it structured slightly differently, where the member wouldn't be able to have any access to that access pot to ensure that maintenance is covered into the future.
And divorce orders?
Divorce orders, again, is a little bit tricky. So I think you have to understand is that pension interest as defined in the Divorce Act is the amount that you're able to access at withdrawal at the date of divorce. So when that divorce order is issued, the non-member spouse would be entitled to a percentage of that amount. So that would be all the amount that you've accumulated except for the retirement pot. So the non-member spouse would potentially get a much lower amount out in terms of the divorce than what is intended. So what we do see is, or I believe is that there'd have to be some change to the definition of pension interest as defined in the Divorce Act. And that would have to happen at the same time with this two-pot system comes into effect.
I think that's it from my questions. Because of time, maybe just in conclusion, I've picked up a couple of things from the discussions we've actually had. I must say, for a second, when you spoke about the 25,000, already started budgeting. And there comes my second one. I'm using that for my logo. But anyway, on a serious note, thank you very much. We've noticed we've kind of running out of time, and what we would suggest is that maybe all the delegates out there, if you feel you've got any questions, please do not hesitate to actually send them through, and detailed answers will be sent. Right. Thank you very much for your time, and hope you have a lovely day. And thank you very much for spending your time with us. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.